Hello everyone and welcome back to the sessions on financial reporting. Friends, in this class of financial reporting, we are continuing with the topic Ind AS 116, that is leases. So friends, in this class, we are going to start with an important concept, that is identifying and separating lease components. So what do we mean by identifying and separating lease components? What are these lease components? Let us try to understand. First thing first, suppose there is a contract of lease. So obviously two parties involved, the lessor and the lessee. The lessor or the supplier has conveyed the right to use multiple assets. So there is a single contract, but the contract conveys the right to use multiple assets. For example, it is building, equipments, machinery, furniture, multiple assets which are being used by the lessee, but there is a single lease contract. So the issue over here that we are supposed to discuss, are we going to consider each asset separately from accounting viewpoint? What I am trying to say is, are we going to make separate accounting for lease of building, lease of machinery, lease of furniture, lease of office equipments? Are we going to have different lease accounting for each asset, or there will be a single lease accounting for the entire group of asset? This is the issue that we have to discuss. In this regard, Ind AS 116 very clearly states a fact that there are two conditions. If both the conditions are fulfilled, then each asset included in the contract will be treated as a separate lease component, and in that case the lessee will be accounting for each asset under a separate lease accounting. That means then there will be a separate accounting for lease of building, lease of furniture, and so on. So what are these two conditions? And mind it, both the conditions need to be fulfilled. Condition number one, that the lessee or the customer is able to use each asset independently, individually, without depending on other assets. Secondly, the other condition is the assets which are included under a contract are not highly interdependent or interrelated to one another. So sometimes it may so happen that the group of assets included in the lease contract, they cannot be used in isolation. That means one asset on its independent or individual basis cannot be used. It has to be grouped along with other asset, otherwise it will not be capable of generating economic benefits for the lessee on a standalone basis. So you can have multiple examples. Just imagine the cinema hall building. If there is a cinema hall building, the building on its own cannot function, right? It has to have that other equipments and furniture attached, then it is usable as a complete asset. In such case, even if the lease contract is mentioning that there are multiple assets, you will be accounting for this whole as a single lease. However, in any other case, I mean there may be different examples. So if you take case of say this studio setup that we have for lecture recording. Now if you look into the kind of assets that we have camera, we have this furniture and other equipments attached, there is a computer system, there is a laptop, there is a sound system. Each individual asset on its own is capable of being functionable, and individually this asset can be used otherwise also. In this case, if this entire studio is taken under a lease, you can consider that each asset included in the lease contract is a separate asset, and you should not account for all these assets together in one group, but there will be separate lease accounting for each asset. On the other side, the example given for cinema hall, there the building, the equipments, the furniture, these are to be used in conjunction to each other. That means individual assets over there cannot be used in isolation. They have to be used as a group of assets, and in such case, even though the lease contract includes multiple assets, those all assets will be accounted for as if it is a single lease. So friends, let me explain this in little more expanded details, and then I'll provide you notes that you should note down. So what we are talking about is a situation where the two parties involved, customer and supplier, they are entering into a contract whereby supplier is offering lease of multiple assets. That means there is a single contract, but the contract includes lease of multiple assets like building, machinery, furniture and equipments. So the whole concern over here is, shall we consider each of these assets, building, machinery, furniture, equipments, as a separate lease component, or should we consider the whole thing combined as a lease component? For this purpose, the criteria is very simple. You just have to look into one thing. This customer, lessee, can the lessee use building, machinery, furniture, each of these assets individually and independently without having interrelationship of other assets? If each asset can be used as a separate individual asset independently, then the lease contract involves lease of 4 different assets. In other words, they'll be accounting for lease of building separately, accounting for lease of machinery separately, accounting for lease of furniture separately, and likewise, if these all assets cannot be used individually and independently, and they can be used only when worked together, in other words, they are highly interrelated or highly interdependent, in that case, lease of multiple assets will be considered as the entire lease component. That means all these lease components will be accounted for as if there is a singular lease. So once again I repeat, if there is individual independent use of these assets possible, then each asset will be accounted for separately as a separate lease component. That means then there will be 4 lease accounting even though there is a single lease contract. On the other side, if these assets are highly interrelated or highly interdependent and they cannot be used individually, they cannot generate economic benefits for the lessee independently or individually, then the lease payments will be accounted for in consolidation of all these 4 assets. In other words, then there will be a single lease component, a single lease accounting inclusive of all assets involved in the lease. So let us do one thing, let us write up the notes about what we have just discussed. Identifying and separating lease components. If a contract contains rights to use multiple assets, the right to use each such asset is considered as a separate lease component only if both the following conditions are satisfied. Condition number 1, the lessee can benefit from the use of asset either on its own or together with other resources that are readily available to the lessee, and the underlying asset is neither highly dependent on nor highly interrelated with other underlying assets in the contract. If any of these criteria are not met, then the right to use these multiple assets is considered as a lease component, that is a single lease component. So friends, I have already explained you this, you just note it down. This is something very, very important. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Let us now apply this concept in solving some questions. Let us take up question number 15. Let us read this question. Again, the question is given in two different scenarios, scenario A and scenario B. Scenario A says a lessee enters a lease of an excavator and the related accessories, for example, excavator attachments that are used for mining purposes. The lessee is a local mining company that intends to use the excavator at a copper mine. How many leases and non-lease components are there? Scenario B says, assume the same facts as in scenario A, except that contract also conveys right to use an additional loading truck. This loading truck could be deployed by lessee for other uses, for example, to transport iron ores at another mine. So, in this question, we are basically required to decide whether there is a single lease component or multiple lease components included. So, let us deal with each scenario one by one. In scenario A, what is the subject matter of lease, or what is the underlying asset under the lease? That is excavator and the related accessories, that is excavator attachments. Now, without the excavator attachments cannot work. This is just like the same type of example what we have learnt long back, that is the lease of tires of a car cannot be used without the car itself. Exactly same way here, the excavator attachments cannot be used without the excavator itself. That means the use of these assets are highly interrelated or highly interdependent. In scenario A, we can conclude that there will be a single lease component of the excavator along with the attachments. In scenario B, there is an additional asset involved, that is a loading truck, and this loading truck could be used by the lessee for other purposes also, where it does not depend upon the excavator. In such case, scenario B can contain multiple lease components, and these lease components would be: number one, the excavator along with its accessories, and the second asset involved would be the loading truck. So, let us see how to write up the answer. So, answer for scenario A would be: the lessee would be unable to benefit from the use of the excavator without also using the accessories. Therefore, the excavator is dependent upon the accessories, or you can also write that the accessories are dependent upon the excavators. Thus, from the perspective of the lessee, the contract contains one lease component, that is a single lease component. Write up this and then I will give you answer for scenario B. Alright friends, you would have written the answer for scenario A. Now let us move ahead and write up the scenario B answer. So scenario B, the lessee can benefit from the loading truck on its own or together with other readily available resources because the loading truck could be deployed for other uses independent of the excavator. The lessee can also benefit from the use of excavator on its own or together with other readily available resources. Thus, from the perspective of the lessee, the contract contains two lease components, that is lease of excavator together with the accessories. That means excavator and accessories are still considered as one component and the lease of the loading truck as a separate component. So friends, write up this as well and that will be completion of your answer. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Let us move ahead and discuss the next concept, that is separation of lease and non-lease components. So friends, here we are talking about a situation where the lease contract is definitely conveying the right to use a leased asset, but along with that leased asset, the lessor also conveys the right to use other services. In such case, there may be inclusion of lease and non-lease components within a lease contract which the standard wants to deal separately. That means the lessee should deal with both these components separately. Let me substantiate this by giving an example. Assume that I want to carry out transportation business. I approach a transport company and request them to provide a truck under a lease. Now, I am not going to drive the truck myself, right? I just want to conduct the transport business. So I will look after the entire business administration and management, and there has to be someone to drive the truck. Transport company has a lot of connections with these drivers and helpers. So I request them that please also provide me a driver and a helper along with the truck. So when I make the lease payments to that transport company, I pay for the truck rentals, I pay for the driver's salary, I pay for the helper's salary. So if you closely look into one thing, the total payment made by me, who is lessee, okay, the total payment made by me includes multiple components. Some are lease components and some are non-lease components. So standard wants the lessee to separate these lease and non-lease components and account for these separately. So what should be done for the truck rentals? Truck rentals should be accounted for as a lease components, and that will be accounted for in accordance with Ind AS 116. On the other side, the salary component, that is the salary of driver and salary of helper, will not be considered as lease component and shall be accounted for in accordance with other standards. Whatever standard applies on that particular component, that being a non-lease component, some other standards will apply. So the relevant standard that applies, you apply that standard. Ind AS 116 in that case will apply only and only to the lease components. Now, while you are dealing with this aspect, you have to be utmost careful about one thing. There may be certain expenses included in the lease payments which you cannot completely consider as lease component or non-lease component. Let me give you an example. Suppose that transport company which has provided me that truck. Now what will happen when I am using a truck in a transport business? There will be some taxes that are payable to the RTO department, correct? The road transport department, it will levy certain taxes on that truck. Now myself, I am the lessee, I am using that truck in my transportation business, but that truck does not belong to me by legal title, correct? As per RTO records or as per transport department records, the truck is owned by the lessor. So when they levy taxes on the truck on annual basis, those taxes will be levied on the lessor and not on me. But lessor would say, when the lessor itself is not using the truck in its business and I am using that truck in my business, logically I should be bearing that expenditure, and lessor would be smart enough to make this point included in the lease contract, that in the event that the lessor makes this payment to the transport department or RTO department, lessor will have right to claim reimbursement from me. And when I make that reimbursement, such types of taxes, insurance, which are generally fixed payments, now you cannot classify these either as lease or as non-lease payments. So what the standard wants you to do, split this also into two components on some rational proportion basis, that what part will be pertaining to the lease component and what part will be pertaining to non-lease components. So friends, let me summarize this whole discussion. What all I am going to pay to the lessor in this transport example? I am going to pay rental of the truck, number one. I am going to pay driver's salary. I am going to pay helper's salary, and I am going to pay the taxes of the truck and insurance premium of the truck. 5 different components included in the lease. How should we deal with this? Point number 1, the truck rental, purely lease component. Driver's salary, helper's salary, purely non-lease component. So now we already got separation of lease and non-lease components done. Now how to separate this, I have yet to talk about that. So don't bother about on what basis we are going to separate this. We will learn that in details later. First you understand that you have separated the lease and non-lease components. Now what you need to do, there are 2 expenses which the lessee has to make payment to the lessor by way of reimbursement, and that will be insurance and taxes. this insurance and tax which is on the vehicle and I have to bear that expenditure, the standard requires the lessee to split that payment also proportionately, some part as lease component and some part as non-lease component. So let me explain this in little more details along with important notes that you should write down. So let us write a note about separation of lease and non-lease components. There may be contracts containing a lease coupled with an agreement to purchase or sell other goods or services. The non-lease components are identified and accounted for separately from the lease components in accordance with other standards. Costs related to property taxes and insurance do not involve the transfer of goods or services. Consequently, if these costs are fixed in the contract, they should be included in the overall contract consideration to be allocated to the lease and non-lease components. Friends, do one thing, first write up this content what you find on screen, and I will be offering some extended explanation to this whole matter in little more details, but first write up what you find on screen. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. So to understand this concept in little more depth, let us move ahead and take some example. So there are two parties involved in a contract, the customer and the supplier, or the lessee and the lessor, and the lessee is taking a truck under a lease and the lessor provides a truck along with a driver, and therefore the lease payments made by the lessee to the lessor includes driver's salary as well. So now the total lease payments can be classified or considered as gross contractual payments, and these payments include definitely two components. One, that is the truck rentals, which will be considered as a lease component, and the component of driver's salary will be considered as a non-lease component. Let us now extend this example and include one more component, that is the taxes that can be levied on the truck. Truck being a transport vehicle, it will be a subject matter of tax relating to transportation activity. So the transport department shall levy taxes on this truck. We should not forget one thing, that the truck, the asset, is in the name of the lessor. That means the legal title to the truck belongs to the lessor. So as per the transport department records, the owner of the truck is this party, that is lessor, correct? So the taxes will be levied on this party and it is the lessor who will be responsible for paying taxes. However, the transport business, that is the use of this truck, is being carried out by the lessee or the customer. As a result, it is the lessee's responsibility to pay the taxes to the lessor, and if the lessor has already paid taxes to the transport department, then the lessee has to reimburse those taxes to the lessor. This will be generally their initial understanding while signing the contract. So what happens now is the lease payments will now include driver's salary as well as tax. So what you need to understand is this whole consolidated payment or the gross contractual payment will still be divided between lease and non-lease components. However, the tax component will be excluded while doing so. In other words, the gross contractual payment will first be considered as excluding tax. That means only the two components, truck rental and driver salary, will be separated as lease components and non-lease component, and the tax will be separately allocated between these two components again. That means the tax on an overall basis paid by the lessor to the transport department, that tax will be allocated between lease and non-lease component exactly in the same proportion as it was for the truck and driver's salary. So friends, whatever we have discussed, let us now move ahead and write up a note in respect of this whole matter. So let us write up that note. Reimbursement made by the lessee to the lessor. Payments for maintenance activities and other goods or services transferred to the lessee are considered as non-lease components because they provide the lessee with a service. But in some cases, a lessee may also reimburse the lessor payments that relate to the leased asset for activities and costs that do not transfer a good or service to the lessee. Such costs, for example taxes and insurance, are considered to be part of the total consideration that is allocated to separately identified lease and non-lease components of the contract. So friends, please write up this whole thing and then we shall move ahead. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Now let us apply this concept in some case study based questions. Let us go ahead and take up question number 16. Let us read this question. Entity L rents an office building from landlord M for a term of 10 years. The rental contract stipulates that office is fully furnished and has a newly installed and tailored HVAC system. It also requires landlord M to perform all common area maintenance during the term of the arrangement. Entity L makes a single monthly rental payment and does not pay for maintenance separately. The office building has a useful life of 40 years and HVAC system and office furniture each has a life of 15 years. What are the units of account in the lease? Indirectly, the question is asking you identify how many components are involved in this arrangement. So what we should do is we should analyze the whole situation and we can find out that there are in total 3 components in the arrangement. One of the component is office building along with HVAC system. Now this HVAC system, can you see it is installed and tailor made. That means this HVAC system is so closely related with building that these cannot be used individually and independently. The use of HVAC system cannot be done without this office building because this was tailor made and designed specifically for this particular building. On the other side, the other asset for which the lease component will exist is the office furniture. Now office furniture can be considered as a separate lease component because office furniture can be used separately as an individual asset without depending on this office building. The third component that we find in the arrangement is about this common area maintenance. The maintenance arrangement is the third component. However, this maintenance arrangement cannot be considered as a lease component. So this maintenance will be considered as a non-lease component. The lessee is making a single monthly rental payment. That means the rental payment includes 3 components. One, for the use of office building along with HVAC. Second, for the office furniture. And third is for the maintenance. So what we can finally conclude is that there are in total 3 components involved in the arrangement, 2 lease components and 1 non-lease component. So let us see how to present the answer. There are 3 components in the arrangement. The building assets, that is office building and HVAC, considered as a single component, the office furniture as the second component and the maintenance agreement as the third component. The office building and HVAC system are one lease component because they cannot function independently of each other. The HVAC system was designed and tailored specifically to be integrated into the office building and cannot be removed and used in another building without incurring substantial costs. So friends, do one thing, write up this much part of the answer first and then I give you the later part of the answer. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this part of the answer. Let us move ahead and write up the later part. We would say the office furniture functions independently and can be used on its own. It is also a lease component because it is a group of distinct assets for which entity L directs the use, and the maintenance agreement is a non-lease component because it is a contract for service and not for the use of a specified asset. So do one thing friends, write up these two paragraphs as well, and that will be end of the answer. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Let us move ahead and now discuss the next point, that is optional exemption of using practical expedient to not to separate non-lease component. Now in this regard, try to understand one thing very clearly. Ind AS 116 has offered a choice to the lessee, that is the lessee can elect, the lessee can choose not to separate lease and non-lease component, and even though the whole contract includes lease and non-lease components together, the lessee can make a choice of not separating them and accounting for the entire lease payment as if it is a single component only and treat it like a lease component. So in such case, if the lessee is making this choice, why is this kind of exemption or why is this kind of election given to the lessee? Owing to the practical difficulty that may sometimes get involved in splitting these payments, the standard has permitted the lessee to do the same thing. However, from lessor's viewpoint, it would be a matter of revenue recognition. So lessor is not allowed to take the benefit of this election. That means lessor is mandatorily required to separate the lease and non-lease components. The lessee has been given a choice that if the lessee is willing to separate, the lessee can do that. If the lessee wants to show the whole lease payment inclusive of lease and non-lease components together, the lessee can make that choice. this could be considered as a practical expedient allowed by the standard. Now, one more very important thing in this case, this should not be cross confused with different lease components. If you can recall the example I have given you earlier, that is lease of building, lease of furniture, lease of equipments, lease of machinery, multiple components included in a lease contract, and if those two conditions are fulfilled, then the lessee must compulsorily show lease of each asset as a separate component. The lessee is not supposed to make that choice or make that election of practical expedient on lease components which are multiple assets. Each asset will be considered as a separate lease if those two conditions that we have discussed earlier are fulfilled. Here the choice is for separating or not separating lease and non-lease components. So friends, in this regard, let us write down some notes. Ind AS 116 provides a practical expedient that permits lessees to make an accounting policy election by class of underlying asset to account for each separate lease component of a contract and any associated non-lease components as a single lease component. Such practical expedient is not permissible for the lessor. Lessees that make such election allocate all of the contract consideration to the lease component. The practical expedient does not allow lessees to account for multiple lease components of a contract as a single lease component if it meets the conditions. So friends, I have already explained you these points. Just take note of this quickly. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Let us move ahead and now write up the basis of allocation. If the lessee definitely makes a choice of not separating the lease and non-lease component and account for the whole thing as if it is a lease payment only or as if it is a lease component only, that is just one choice. What if the lessee does not make that choice and the lessee wants to separate the lease and non-lease component and account for these two separately? Then the total payment needs to be allocated between the lease and non-lease component. So we need to understand on what basis will you make allocation. You should not be wrongly driven away by the amounts that you are paying individually, because the prices that you are paying could be manipulated. Therefore, don't look into how much you are paying under the contract. Instead, look into what would be the standalone price, the relative standalone prices for each of these components, that is lease component and non-lease component. If you would have taken that lease component separately, just that, or the non-lease component separately, just that, how much you would have paid individually for each of these. That becomes the kind of fair value of these two components, which we will call as the relative standalone prices of these two components. On the basis of those relative standalone prices, the allocation has to be made. Now, in this regard, another practical difficulty that may arise is the lessee does not have sufficient observable inputs, or you can say does not have sufficient information about relative standalone prices. In such cases, what you can simply do is, as a lessee, you can make estimations, and based on estimations the allocation can be done. That means if you do not have the direct information about the relative standalone prices of lease and non-lease components, you can make your own estimates. Based on that estimation also the allocation can be made. So let us continue to write up that note. So we have already discussed this point as well. Determining and allocating the consideration in the contract. Lessees that do not make such election means election of not separating lease and non-lease components. So in such cases, lessees are required to allocate the consideration in the contract to the lease and non-lease component on a relative standalone price basis. Now the question is, what if there is no clear information available with respect to the standalone prices? So if observable standalone prices are not readily available, lessees estimate standalone prices, maximizing the use of observable information. So as much information you have in terms of observable information, you may make use of that, and in places where you do not have any observable information, you may make estimates. That is what required by Ind AS 116. So write down this point as well, and then we move to questions. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this thing. Let us move ahead and now take up a question, that is question number 17. Let us read this question. Again, this question is given in two different scenarios, scenario A and scenario B. Scenario A says, a lessee enters into a 5-year lease of equipment with fixed annual payments of rupees 10,000. The contract contains fixed annual payments as follows: 8,000 for rent, 1,500 for maintenance, and rupees 500 of administrative task. How the consideration would be allocated? So basically, if you look into one thing, in scenario A, annual lease payment will be 10,000 in total, all three components included, and this is for a period of 5 years. So in total, the lessee would end up paying 50,000 rupees to the lessor over a period of 5 years. Now obviously what we find is rent of the equipment and the maintenance are two separate components. So rent will be considered as the lease component and the maintenance will be considered as a non-lease component. On the other side, rupees 500 of administrative charges, which could be obviously fixed administrative charges, this will be allocated between rent and maintenance in the appropriate ratio. And that is how you are going to deal with that 50,000, that is 10,000 every year for 5 years in scenario A. Now let us come to scenario B. It says, assume the fact pattern as in scenario A, except that in addition the contract requires lessee to pay for restoration of equipment to its original condition. How the consideration would be allocated? Now friends, if you can recall, we have learnt something about restoration and decommissioning liability under Ind AS 37. The present value of such liability shall be recognized, and when it is charged to cost over the period of lease, it will be again allocated between lease and non-lease components on appropriate ratio basis. So we shall simply conclude that the total payment will be classified between the lease and non-lease components over the lease term of 5 years. So let us see how to present the answer. So first, the answer for scenario A. The contract contains two components, that is a lease component, that is lease of equipment, and a non-lease component, that is the maintenance. The amount paid for administrative tasks does not transfer a good or service to the lessee. The lessee shall account for the lease of equipment and maintenance component separately, and the administration charge is included in the total consideration to be allocated between those components. Exactly, if you can recall the way we have learned the allocation of taxes, right? Like that, this administration charge will be allocated. You may write further that therefore the total consideration of rupees 50,000, I'm sure you understand what is that rupees 50,000. It is 10,000 of annual lease payment over a period of 5 years, that makes it total 50,000 in the contract, will be allocated to the lease component, that is equipment, and non-lease component, that is maintenance, over the lease term of 5 years. And over here we are assuming that the lessee does not elect the practical expedient of reporting lease and non-lease components jointly. In other words, the lessee elects to report the lease and non-lease components separately as originally required by the standard. So do one thing friends, write up this whole thing, and that will be the answer for scenario A. I shall then display the answer for scenario B as well. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Let us move ahead and write up the answer for scenario B. In scenario B, you will write the contract still contains two components, that is a lease component, that is lease of equipment, and a non-lease component, that is maintenance. Similar to the amount paid for administrative task, the restoration does not transfer a good or a service to the lessee as it is only performed at the end of the lease term. However, as per Ind AS 37, what we have learnt, the present value of that shall be recognized immediately. So, you will write further, therefore, the total consideration of rupees 50,000 in the contract along with the present value of restoration liability shall be allocated over the lease term between the lease and non-lease components. So, write up this as well, and that will be end of the answer. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this answer. Let us move ahead and take up the next question, that is question number 18, and see what is given over here. A lessee enters into a lease of an equipment. The contract stipulates the lessor will perform maintenance of the leased equipment and receive consideration for the maintenance services. The contract includes the following fixed prices for the lease and non-lease component. Lease rupees 80,000 and maintenance rupees 10,000. Total amount payable is 90,000. Now further it is given, assume that the standalone prices cannot be readily observed, so the lessee makes estimate, that is maximizing the use of observable information of the lease and non-lease components as follows. Lease fair value or the standalone price is 85,000 and maintenance if you would have taken it individually, such kind of services, the fair value of that services would have been 15,000. So that total comes to 1 lakh. In the given scenario, assuming lessee has not opted the practical expedient, how will the lessee allocate the consideration to lease and non-lease components? So friends, first of all, lease and non-lease amounts have been given to us directly, 90,000 as total amount, and the split is given between the two. I'll show you that part of the question once again. You can see this amount 90,000 what is payable is already allocated between the lease and maintenance as 80,000 and 10,000, but do not ever commit mistake of considering the split of 90,000 as 80,000 and 10,000. In fact, what you shall do is the 90,000 amount shall be divided between lease and non-lease component, that is the equipment and maintenance, in the ratio of their relative standalone prices, or in absence of the relative standalone price information, you have taken the estimates of those standalone prices for these two components. In other words, 90,000 of total consideration will be divided between lease of equipment and maintenance, that is lease and non-lease component, in the ratio of 85 and 15. That means 85% of 90,000 will be considered as lease component, and 15% of that total 90,000 will be considered as towards maintenance or non-lease component. So let us see how to present the answer. The standalone price for the lease component represents 85%, that is 85,000 out of 1 lakh of total estimated standalone prices. The lessee allocates the consideration in the contract, that is 90,000, as follows. So as I told you, the lease part will be 76,500, which is 85% of 90,000, and maintenance part will be 13,500, which is 15% of 90,000. So total amount is definitely 90,000. And how we got these two amounts of 76,500 and 13,500? It is nothing but 90,000, which is split in the ratio of 85 and 15. So what you find on screen is the answer. Please take note of the same. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Let us move ahead and take up the next concept for discussion, that is contract combinations. So friends, by far we were discussing about situations where there was a single contract and there were multiple assets involved, and we were trying to separate each of the asset as if there are different lease arrangements. In other words, single contract had been segmented into different contracts, each asset considered as a separate lease. Now we are talking about exactly a reversal situation where there may be multiple contracts, two or more contracts, but taken up with the same supplier, that is same lessor, and the assets under each of the contracts taken in a way that these assets are to be used as a single component. If you remember the example of cinema hall that I have discussed some time back, now if I reverse the situation now is you have taken a contract to use a cinema hall building, you have taken another contract to use cinema hall equipments, you have taken yet another contract to use cinema hall furniture. Now these three assets are such assets which cannot be used independently, but now there are three different contracts that you have entered into with a lessor. So you are a lessee having three different contracts, and these assets are actually to be used in conjunction, and therefore it makes sense to consider this whole as a single lease component. So we are now trying to merge different contracts as if it is one single lease component. So friends, as per Ind AS 116, there are three conditions given. Any one condition you fulfill, it is enough. So just take care of one thing, any one condition needs to be fulfilled. Condition number one, you have negotiated all these assets as a single package. Second condition is the price of one of the asset depends upon the price of the other. That means the lease rental that you have decided for one depends upon the negotiation of the other. And third, the whole combination of these assets appear to be a single lease component. So when any of these three conditions are met, any one condition out of the three, you can combine multiple lease contracts as if it is a single lease component. However, one thing cannot be ignored, these all contracts should be entered into at the same time or nearly at the same time, and secondly, all these should have a common party as supplier. Means if these contracts are taken from different parties, definitely you cannot combine all of them. So let us write up note about this. Two or more contracts entered into at or near the same time with the same counterparty be considered a single contract if any one of the following criteria is met. So out of the three conditions, as I have mentioned, you just need to fulfill any one of these conditions. First condition, first criteria is the contracts are negotiated as a package with an overall commercial objective that cannot be understood without considering the contracts together. Or second condition, the amount of consideration to be paid in one contract depends on the price or performance of the other contract. Or the third condition is the rights to use the underlying assets conveyed in the contracts are a single lease component. So friends, write this much quickly and then we shall move ahead. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Let us move ahead and talk about the next concept, that is portfolio application. Now here it may so happen that an entity has entered into lease arrangements of similar type of assets. So the similar type of asset, but there are multiple number of assets. So if you can look into one thing, suppose a railway company has taken rolling stocks for multiple number of such units, and there are multiple lease arrangements, but all these lease arrangements indicate same type of asset. In such cases, if you could see, it makes no sense to go for asset by asset or lease by lease basis if there are multiple number of assets, whereas the functioning of all the assets is similar, and it makes sense to consider all this as if it is a singular arrangement. So here comes concept of a portfolio. So instead of accounting for lease by lease basis, you sum up all of these and use a portfolio approach for reporting. Now this is again a practical expedient available in the standard, that is under Ind AS 116. There is no compulsion, it is a choice given to the lessee. If the lessee wants to do this, lessee is definitely allowed to do this. So let us write up the note about portfolio application that we have just discussed. Entity having a large number of leases of similar assets may face practical challenges in applying the lease accounting on a lease by lease basis. Ind AS 116 allows entities to use a portfolio approach for leases with similar characteristics if the entity reasonably expects that the effects on the financial statements would not differ materially from the application of the standard to the individual leases in that portfolio. So friends, write up this note and then we shall move ahead. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Let us move ahead and talk about the next concept, that is inception and commencement of a lease. Now if you ask what is the meaning of inception of the lease, someone would say beginning of the lease. What is the commencement of the lease? That is also beginning of the lease. So you might get confused if you are not clearly aware of what is the difference between inception and commencement of a lease. So friends, inception of the lease is first of all important to identify whether a lease exists in a given contract or not. In other words, when the two parties get involved in a contract where there is a possibility that there may be a lease, these two parties would first raise a question, would first make an analysis whether a lease is present in this contract or not. Is there a lease arrangement involved? This assessment is made at a date, and that is called inception date. So what is the meaning of inception date? When the two parties agree for conveying the right of use of one asset by one to the other, that date when the parties agree, the contract entering date is called the inception date. So what would be the commencement date? The date at which the two parties actually execute the contract. That means the performance begin. For example, on January 1, 2020, I enter into a contract with a party to take a premises on lease, and the lease shall begin from 15th January 2020. So contract was entered into on 1st January 2020 and the lease actually begins from 15th January 2020. So in that example, 15th January 2020 shall be considered as the commencement date, and 1st January 2020 will be the inception date. So friends, inception date is the date when the two parties agree. That means the contract is signed or they agree for principal terms of the contract. It is that date at which the decision is taken by parties whether a lease is involved in the contract or not. On the other side, commencement date is the actual execution of the contract, where you can consider commencement date as the date on which the lessor conveys to the lessee the right of use of the asset that belongs to the lessor. Now, some important factors should be understood over here. Friends, in general business terms, what happens when we take some classrooms on lease for live classes, or when we take places like this studio for a lease, the place is taken on a lease, but then this will be a simple looking ordinary office building. We have to give it a structure of a studio. That means we have to develop all these interiors and designing the way we want. In such case, this takes some time. So what happens, suppose it takes 1 month time. I would always request the lessor that please give me some time, that I don't pay rent for that period, and let me make the benefit of the space available for just developing or modifying the infrastructure, and the asset needs to be prepared before it is used. So actually I am using the building little later. So assume that on 1st April I have obtained the right of using a building, but I will start paying rent from 1st May. 1 month has been given as the interior designing period, or you can say modification period, by the lessor. Thanks to the lessor, the lessor has agreed not to charge any rent. In such case, rentals begin from 1st May, but the right of use has been conveyed on 1st April. So the commencement date will not be 1st May, it will be 1st April. So friends, remember one thing, even if the rent payment is delayed, even if the actual operations are delayed, which is the date on which the lessee obtains the right to use, the right to control the use of the asset or right to direct the use of the asset, that date onward you will say that the lease has commenced, and that date is called commencement date. Friends, these dates are also important so that you can understand what is the lease term. Now, you are going to consider lease term as the duration of the lease. So, it has to have a specific start date and a specific end date. So, we will have to talk about what date the lease will start, what date the lease will end. For this purpose, it is not the inception date that will be considered as beginning of the lease, it is the commencement date which will be considered as beginning of the lease period. So, friends, these important points what I have discussed needs to be written down. So, let us write up the note about inception and commencement of lease, what we have just discussed. Ind AS 116 requires customers and suppliers to determine whether a contract is or contains a lease at the inception of the contract. The inception date is defined as the earlier of the following dates: date of a lease agreement or date of commitment by parties to the principal terms and conditions of the lease. So friends, quickly take note of this whole thing and then we shall move ahead. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing about inception of the contract. Now let us write something about commencement of the lease, what we have already discussed just now. So the commencement date is defined as the date on which lessor makes an underlying asset available for use by a lessee. In certain cases, the commencement date of the lease may be before the date on which the rents become due and payable. This often occurs when the leased space is modified by the lessee prior to commencing operations in the leased space. If lessee is given control over the use of underlying asset before it begins operations or makes lease payments, the lease term has commenced even if the lessee is not required to pay rent. So friends, all these points we have already discussed. Quickly take note of this and then we shall move ahead. Alright friends, you would have finished writing even this part. Let us now move ahead and write something more about inception date and commencement date. So, inception date is the date when an entity shall assess if the contract is or contains a lease. it is the commencement date on which the lessee initially recognizes a lease liability and related right of use asset, that is ROU asset, and the lessor, particularly for the finance leases, initially recognizes its net investment in the lease. That means the lessor and lessee both are recognizing the leases at the commencement date. This is something important. So accounting entries begin from commencement date and not from the inception date. I have already explained you this point. Be careful while writing this whole thing. You should be very clearly distinguishing what is inception date and what is commencement date. Write few more lines ahead. The lease term begins at the lease commencement date. So when we say there is a term called lease term, that is the duration of the lease, it will always begin with the commencement date, not at the inception date. And ROU asset is defined as an asset that represents a lessee's right to use an underlying asset for the lease term. So friends, I told you earlier, sooner we are going to step into the accounting part of it, but so that you should be comfortable with the accounting part, you should be very clear with the theory part, what we are discussing and writing notes right now. So quickly take note of this and then we shall move ahead.